I love to hear Karen play, and I'm sure you do as well, and probably like me. And I mean this in a good way, Karen. It makes me sick. Uh, that type of talent, though, it's such a blessing, and we're grateful that you use it here for the Lord's glory with us. This past Tuesday night, I had to make a number of different stops, running some errands, going to some different stores. And Nathan, our oldest, our 8-year-old, went with me. And our last stop was at Harris Teeter, at the grocery store. And having been at this point to 5 or 6 places, so we're getting ready to check out. And Nathan says, "Hey, Daddy, can I get some candy?" And normally he didn't ask for anything like that. And even if he did, normally I would say no. But we'd been to so many different places. He'd been so good. I said, "Yeah, Nathan, go ahead and pick out something." And so he goes over to the candy section of the checkout area, and he picks up a pack of orange Tic Tacs. Orange Tic Tacs, I don't know if you were aware of, they make lousy breath mints, but they make delicious candy. All right, so Nathan picks up these orange Tic Tacs. I pay for them with whatever else we were getting, and we head out of the store. Nathan begins to open them, and he takes a couple of them. He gives me a couple of them, and then we get in the car, and we're headed home. And every few minutes or so, I hear Nathan opening those Tic Tacs again and getting a few more out. And I said to him, "Nathan, now don't eat all of those because your brothers didn't get any. I want you to be able to share some of those with them when you get home." And Nathan says, "Okay," but then he adds something else to it. But this past week, Caroline's mother stayed with us for a couple of nights, and she was still there with us. And so Nathan, after I've encouraged him to share with his brothers, he said, "I'll share some with Grandma too." And I said, "Nathan, Grandma probably won't want any." He said, "Oh, I bet she will." I said, "Why do you say that?" He said, "Because old people like hard candy." Who knew? And so after he said that, I said to him, just out of curiosity, I said, "Well, Nathan, why do you say that?" He said, "Because that chewy kind pulls their teeth out." Were there amens among the laughter? In the mind of an 8-year-old, things are pretty simple. If this, then that. If you're old, you like hard candy. It's just that clear cut. It's that simple. Wouldn't it be nice if every observation and every deduction in life were that simple? Wouldn't it be nice if every deduction had a litmus test that simple? If this, then that. This morning we're beginning a new series of messages that I've entitled The Lone Rangers. And it's going to be a series where we're walking through the life of the Old Testament king of Israel, a guy named Saul. You may already know this, but in case you didn't, we're going to come to discover in the coming weeks that Saul was a man who, though he believed in God and had a relationship with God, in so many ways, he lived his life completely without God. It's as if he was saying to the Lord, "Hey, it's okay. I've got things taken care of. I don't really need you for anything." And he didn't say so much with his words, but it is true that he demonstrated that and proved that that was the feeling of his heart through his actions. Now, unfortunately, this Lone Ranger type mentality was not something that Saul had a monopoly on back in his day. And it's certainly something that still continues to exist, I would say, even among epidemic proportions among those that profess today to be followers of God. And it's not necessarily that we intend to, that we want to actively say with our words, "Hey, God, I just don't need you. I can take care of this on my own. I'm okay being a Lone Ranger." But it is entirely possible, and for so many, it's likely that this syndrome, this mentality has affected you. Wouldn't it be nice if there was some sort of litmus test, and if this, then that you could identify if this mentality has begun to creep into your mind and settle into your heart? Wouldn't it be nice if there was some sort of criteria, some type of test that you could evaluate your own self through? Now, after all, we'll discover it's easy to see this in the life of Saul. It's easy always to see the fault, the failures, and the misgivings of others. It's more difficult to see it in our own lives. Wouldn't it be nice if there was something available for us to see if we have been afflicted with a Lone Ranger mentality? Well, I believe, quite frankly, that the Bible gives us those tests. It provides for us those criteria so that we can use them and identify whether or not we are part of this group, the Lone Rangers. Well, we see those criteria, we see those tests in 1 Samuel chapters 9 and 10. 1 Samuel chapter 9. If you would grab a Bible and open there with me, And I hope this doesn't frighten you, but we're going to go through the entire 9th and 10th chapters this morning. And we won't be reading, obviously, all of that, but we're going to be dropping in a number of places so that you can get this story that's going on. 1 Samuel chapters 9 and 10. All right. These chapters reveal to us criteria that we can use to evaluate and look at our own selves in the mirror to see if this Lone Ranger mentality has affected us. And the first criteria that we're going to see revealed is this: you are a Lone Ranger if God's activity prompts a focus on personal abilities. You're a Lone Ranger. You're acting as though you don't need God's help if His activity prompts a focus on your personal abilities. Before we get into the text, let me set the stage for you. For generations, the children of Israel have longed for something. They started paying attention to all the other countries and kingdoms around them, and they noticed, hey, every one of those has got a king. And so they decided, we need one of those. So they began to call out to God, God, how about giving us a king? And God's answer consistently was no. You don't need to be like everybody else. You're special. You're my chosen people. You don't need a king. I will be your king. And collectively, Israel's response was, yeah, that's nice. How about giving us a king? For generations, they have been asking for this. And finally, what we see is that God has relented, and He's going to give them what they've asked for. He's going to grant that desire for them, and they're going to, in the generations to come, experience the consequences from that. And God leads His prophet, this great hero of the Old Testament, Samuel, to go and anoint Israel's first king, a man that God has already selected, a man named Saul. You see him in verse 1, we're introduced to him. We're told that there was a man of Benjamin, the tribe of Benjamin, whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, and you see some genealogy there. Verse 2 tells us that he had a choice and handsome son whose name was Saul. There was not a more handsome person than he among the children of Israel. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people. All right, so this is the man. Saul is the guy that God has decided, I want this to be Israel's first king. Now, we're told in these couple of verses a few things about Saul. First of all, he's of the tribe of Benjamin. A man named Kish is his father. Furthermore, Saul is apparently a very ridiculously handsome man. And in fact, this is something that gets repeated in these chapters. He is a man with striking looks. Beyond that, it's also notable that he's described as being a tall man. It says from his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people. Literally, he was head and shoulders above everyone else. This was a tall, handsome man. And God has decided, I want this to be the first king of Israel. Well, Saul doesn't know this. He's just operating in his ordinary life. By the time you get to verse 3, there's a problem. We're told the donkeys of Kish, Saul's father, were lost. And Kish said to his son, please take one of the servants with you. Arise and go look for the donkeys. So, meanwhile, Saul's unaware that God's chosen him, that He's got big plans for him. And his father's donkeys go missing. And so he tells Saul, get a servant, go see if you can find them. And so they head out, and they're going to all the likely places, fields and pastures. They're going from village to town, and days are passing, and they can't find these donkeys anywhere. As the chapter unfolds, Saul gets to the point where he says, we've been gone an awfully long time. I think we just need to give up and say, we can't find the donkeys. And the servant says, you know what? I think not far from here, there's the prophet of God, Samuel. He's got this inside connection with God. Maybe we could go talk to him, and he could ask the Lord, where are the donkeys? And we might be able to find out where they are. Saul thinks this is a good idea, and so they're going to head the next day to see Samuel. Well, while that's going on, God has spoken to Samuel and said, tomorrow, about this time, a man from the tribe of Benjamin you're going to meet for the very first time. And he is the man that I want you to anoint as Israel's first king. And so the next day comes, and Saul and his servant go to meet Samuel. And when they meet Samuel, we're told that the Spirit of God confirmed to Samuel, "This is the one." In verse 17, God says, "There he is, the man of whom I spoke to you. This one shall reign over my people." And so God's saying to Samuel, "This is the one. Let there be no ambiguity about this." And so at this point, this conversation begins to take place between Saul and Samuel. And you see part of this conversation in verse 20. He says, "As for your donkeys that were lost 3 days ago, do not be anxious about them, they've been found." So you're here looking for donkeys, don't worry about them, they're taken care of. But then he says this, "On whom is all the desire of Israel? Is it not on you and all of your father's house?" Now, if you were just reading this for the very first time and had no idea the backstory, you'd say, well, what's he talking about? I mean, this seems to be veiled language. But Saul, it's clear, he understood exactly what Samuel was talking about. When Samuel references the desire of Israel, it seems that everybody knew the desire of the nation was for a king. So Samuel is saying to him, on who is the desire for a king? This desire of all the nation of Israel, who's it resting on? And he says, is it not you? You're the one. You're the one that the nation has been longing for. You're the one that is the answer by God to the people's desire for a king. All right, so he hears in explicit terms, you're the one. You're going to be the first king of Israel, but look at his response in verse 21. He says this, "Am I not a Benjamite, of the smallest of the tribes of Israel, and my family the least of all the families of the tribe of Benjamin? Why then do you speak to me this way?" Saul is saying to him, listen here, Samuel, you've lost your mind. I'm from the tribe of Benjamin. In case you have forgotten, that's the smallest of all the tribes. And within that tribe, I'm from one of the smallest, least consequential families or clans. We don't have any clout. We don't have any influence. And so this whole notion of me being a king, why in the world are you talking to me this way? God is showing Saul what he's up to. And what is Saul's focus on? It's on what he can, or in this case, cannot do. He's thinking about his own abilities. He's thinking about the limitations. And as the life and the reign of Saul begin to unfold from this point, he is going to be for us a glaring example of a man who operated as a lone ranger. And he demonstrated through his actions. He was saying to God, listen, I don't need your help. I can take things from here. I don't have to have your input, your advice, your counsel, your power. I can just take care of everything. He operated like a lone ranger, and we see here, even early in life, he's operating in this way that puts him on that path, one that he will stay on for the remainder of his days. God is in the process of doing something significant. He's granting to his people the desire of their heart. He's guided his prophet Samuel to inform Saul of God's choice for him to be the king, and when he discovers what God is up to, when he sees the activity of God, what is his focus on? It's on his own personal abilities, what he can and what, in this case, he cannot do. Why is that? Because that's how Lone Rangers operate. Lone Rangers operate with the thought, with the mentality, with the attitude, everything rests on me. Everything depends on me. And so when you hear about the activity, the work, and the plan of God, you start thinking about that through the lens of your own personal abilities because you think everything depends on you. There is nothing in what Saul says to Samuel's statement that reflects trust and dependence on God. There's nothing that Saul says that indicates, man, this is a shock. I'm surprised by this. You know, I don't know if you know, I'm guessing God is in this, and if that's the case, he's somehow going to take care of it. You don't see any of that. All you see is him focusing on his own abilities, his own limitations, because he is a lone ranger. I remember the first conversation that I had with anybody from this church. It was back when you were without a pastor. You had a pastor search committee, and Ed Carmichael was the chair of that committee. I'd received an email from him. The church had gotten my name. And I received this email from him, and it asked a question in the email, and I could have just as easily written back to him, but he included his phone number, and so I thought, well, I'll just call him and talk to him. And as I recall, it was on a Friday night, and Ed answered the phone, and we probably talked for 30 or 45 minutes. And I remember getting off the phone, I told Caroline, I said, I don't know what, if anything, may come from that, but I just enjoyed the conversation. It was very pleasant. And in the course of conversation, Ed was very candid and forthright in painting the picture of what was going on at Gate City, things that had occurred really since its inception, the highs and the lows, the strengths, the challenges. And at that point, there were some marked challenges during this season without a pastor. And he said this. He said, our church has got to have a pastor. We've just got to. But as true as that is, it is equally true we can't afford to pay one. So we know what we've got to have, but we also know we can't pay for what we've got to have. Typically, if you're a prospective pastor, those are not the most glaring comments that you want to hear. But this was my response to Ed that night. I said, Ed, you know what? I don't know if God's in this or not. I don't have any sense about it one way or the other. It's too early. And I said, but this I believe with all my heart. If God's in this, He'll take care of the details. If God's in this, He'll take care of the details. You know what? God was in it, and He took care of the details. Y'all pay me entirely too much now. Thank you for not amening that. If God's in this, He'll take care of the details. I don't share that to you as a prideful statement to say, look at me, I've got my act together and this whole trusting God thing down, that I get it right all the time, because that's absolutely not the case. That there are so many times I struggle like you in this whole act and this practice of trusting God, but I do share that to say this. Oftentimes, when God seeks and works to provide an opportunity, to open a door or guide in a particular way, when we see any measure of challenge, this becomes our first thought. How can I make this work? What can I do to make this happen? What are we doing? We're thinking everything revolves around us. That type of mentality, that type of thinking, that type of attitude is Lone Ranger thinking. And God's not looking for Lone Rangers. God's not looking for people that He can simply say, okay, here's the task, you go off and do that. I'll go busy myself with something else and we'll check up with each other later. God doesn't operate that way. He's looking for people that He can work through, because God wants it to be His work through you. God's not interested in me and you dreaming up things that we can do or can accomplish in His name or for His sake. He's looking for people that He can accomplish and use His power through to accomplish His plan and His work. Do you remember the words of Jesus in John chapter 15? In verse 5, He says this, I am the vine, you are the branches. He that remains in me and I in him, the same brings forth much fruit. This is the kicker. For apart from me, you can do nothing. Now, when Jesus said, apart from me, you can do nothing, don't take that in an absolute literal sense. You can't make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. You can't drive home. You can't fix lunch. You can't comb your hair. You can't have a job. You can't raise children. You can't do anything. When Jesus says, apart from me, you can do nothing, this, I believe, is what Jesus means. Apart from me, you can do absolutely nothing of eternal consequence in the life of somebody else. Apart from Jesus, you can stand and teach a Sunday school class. Apart from Jesus, I can stand here and preach a sermon. I can do that. You can do that. But it won't touch anybody. It will have no impact. It will have no eternal consequence when it revolves around you. Why? Because Jesus said, you abide in me, fruit will come. Because apart from me, nothing of consequence can occur. But Saul wasn't thinking about that, because Saul was a Lone Ranger. And Lone Rangers think, everything rests on my shoulders. If it's going to get done, I've got to do it. I've got to figure it out. This whole king thing, that's too big. I'm from the tribe of Benjamin. I'm from a small family. He wasn't thinking about what God could do. He was thinking about only what he can do. That's what Lone Rangers do. God's activity prompts an awareness or a focus on personal abilities. That's the first litmus test. Here's the second one. God's work prompts indifference to the wrong things. God's work prompts indifference to the wrong things. Samuel has announced to Saul, this is God's choice. You're the desire of the nation. God selected you. And God leads Samuel to take his horn of oil, and he pours this oil out onto Saul's head to anoint him. He is technically now the first king of Israel. And to the new king, Samuel has some instructions that God wanted him to share. And he says, tomorrow you're going to encounter 3 prophets. You see this as chapter 10 unfolds. You're going to encounter 3 prophets. And when that happens, the Spirit of God is going to come upon you, and you're going to prophesy. And He is going to, according to verse 6 of chapter 10, you'll be turned into another man. Verse 6, the Spirit of the Lord will come upon you, you will prophesy with Him and be turned into another man. That doesn't mean that God was going to turn Saul into Jiminy Cricket. He was trying to describe the fact God is changing you. He's making you into something you were not before. You know, prior to all this, you were just Saul, the son of Kish. You've been anointed now by the prophet. God's demonstrating, hey, I'm going to anoint you now with my Spirit. And so Saul does exactly what he's told. The next day he comes alongside, and there's these 3 prophets that he encounters. And the Spirit of God rests on him, and he begins to speak. And he's communicating godly and biblical truth in ways he's never done before. God's speaking to him things that he's never thought before, never entertained. And it's amazing. And these prophets, these prophets that he's talking to, they're amazed. They're astounded. They know who Saul is. This type of talk coming from him is strange. In fact, they even wonder, are you now one of the prophets? So God has really shown up and confirmed what He's up to. He's spoken through Samuel. He's been anointed with oil. He's spoken through His Spirit, and He's been anointed with the Spirit of God. By the time you get to verse 14, though, it's time for Saul to get back home. And so when he arrives home, the first person that he meets is his uncle. And Saul's uncle in verse 14 of chapter 10 said to him, where'd you go? We hadn't seen you for a while. We don't know exactly how many days. It could have been a week or 2. Where did you go? And Samuel said, to look for the donkeys. When we saw that they were nowhere to be found, we went to Samuel. Thought maybe he might be able to help us. And Saul's uncle in verse 15 said, tell me, please, what did Samuel say to you? Look at in verse 16. This is amazing to me. Look at Saul's response in verse 16. He says, he told us plainly that the donkeys had been found. He told us plainly that the donkeys had been found, and that's it. I mean, do you see what's going on? This is the singular biggest thing that has ever happened in the life of this man named Saul. He is not simply going to be, he's not getting a promotion. He's not going to be a manager. He's going to be the king. Not just any king, the first king of the nation of Israel. Not just any nation, the nation of the people of God, chosen among the nations of the world. And God has raised up Samuel, not Gomer from the filling station. He's raised up Samuel, this hero of the Old Testament, to go and confront him with the choice of God. He's further confirmed that with His Spirit speaking through him, leading him to prophesy in ways that others think, are you a prophet? He's now the first king of Israel. This is the biggest thing that's ever happened to him. One of the most consequential historical events in the life of the nation of Israel. And what is Saul talking about? Donkeys. Donkeys. I don't get that. Why in the world is he not saying, donkeys? Well, who cares about donkeys? This is what has happened to me. The Spirit of God is at work, and He's revealing to Saul, this is what I am up to. This is my plan, and this is how it involves you. And when He has disclosed for him the work of God and God's plans for him, it prompts indifference in Saul's heart. It prompts indifference in his life. Unfortunately, it prompts indifference about the wrong things. God is at work, and Saul has a palpable difference. There's no sense of awe at the task. He's not prompted with humility. He's not prompted with gratitude for the honor that God has bestowed on him. Before all of this has happened, he was thinking about, looking for, and talking about donkeys. After this amazing series of events, he's still thinking about and talking about donkeys. There's indifference, but it's indifference to the wrong things. You've heard me mention before my friend Alan. We've known each other since high school, been good friends and remain good friends. And I'd say we talk on the phone with each other probably 2 or 3 times a week. Most of the time I talk to him in the car, sometimes at home. And Alan and I are the same age, but he and his wife Beth got married just, 4 or 5 years ago. And so they've been married less time than Caroline and I. But let's say I have been talking to him as I did on the phone from home back when he and Beth were dating, and then during that engagement and wedding planning time. I would get off the phone with Alan, and Caroline would ask me, so how's Beth doing? I don't know. We didn't talk about her. Well, how's the wedding plans going? Does she have a dress? Do they have a place for the reception? Yeah, I don't know. We didn't talk about it. Well, do they know where they're going to live? Do they have somewhere they're going to go on the honeymoon? I don't know. We didn't talk about it. Well, fast forward a few years now. They have a 2.5-year-old son. They've got a 6-month-old little girl. Back during the seasons, in particular, when Beth was pregnant and expecting, and then especially in those early weeks and months after these babies were born, I'd get off the phone with Alan, and Caroline would say, well, how are the babies doing? Are they sleeping at night? Yeah, I don't know. We didn't talk about it. Well, is Beth is she getting some sleep? Is she feeling okay? Yeah, I don't know. We didn't talk about it. Well, do they know what they're going to do and how long she's going to stay out of work, anything like that? I don't know. We didn't talk about it. Well, at this point, Caroline has virtually given up on asking me, what did you talk about? When I say to her, we talked about nothing, she's come to discover that's exactly what we talk about, absolutely nothing. But one time I remember she pressed me. Well, so, y'all were on the phone for a while. What is it you were talking about? I don't know. We talked about stuff that we saw on TV. There was some crazy lady at Walmart we talked about, and there was some bathroom at work that smelled really bad. And so that's what we were talking about. If it's a matter of consequence, we don't talk about it. We literally, genuinely talk about nothing that matters. That's okay for a phone conversation with old friends, but it's lousy when it comes to our walk with God. Let me ask you a simple question. Do you want to be operating spiritually as a Lone Ranger? Do you want to effectively look at the God of the universe and say, you can go ahead and go about your business. You can head over to the sidelines. If you can take a nap, you can do whatever you want to. I've got this from here. Do you want to do that? If the answer is no, understand this. Whenever the God of the universe shows you what He is up to and how that involves you, everything else is details. Everything else should spawn and prompt a measure of indifference. When God shows you what He's up to and how that involves you and how He plans to work through you, it should spawn some indifference, but indifference to the right things. Saul was a Lone Ranger. When God showed him what he was up to, Saul's focus on donkeys. He was indifferent just to the wrong things. There's a final criteria, what you see in this passage, and that's this. God's confirmations prompt an absence of courage. God's confirmations prompt an absence of courage. At this point, Saul is technically and practically the king. He's been anointed by the prophet. He's been anointed by the Lord. He's now the king. But Israel doesn't know that they have a king yet. They need to be informed of this, and if Saul's not going to tell them, well, Samuel's going to. And as chapter 10 unfolds, Samuel gathers the nation of Israel out before him. He has them grouped by the tribe. And as he groups them by tribe, he makes an announcement. And he begins at first by chiding them. He reminds them from whence they've come and describes how God had rescued them and delivered them out of slavery and bondage. He describes how God had provided for them and how God wanted to be their king, but you in your hard-heartedness, you decided you wanted to have a king. Finally, God is answering the desire of your heart. You're going to get a king. He is from the tribe of Benjamin. He's the son of Kish. It's Saul. Saul, could you please come up here and join me on the platform? I don't see Saul. People start looking for Saul. Nobody can find him. They start scouring. Folks are beginning to say, well, is Saul here at all? And so they get to the point where they have to ask God, God, where is he? Verse 22, the Lord answers, and he says, there he is, hidden among the equipment. Saul, Israel's first king, when it's time for the curtain to be raised, for him to step into the limelight and to be presented as Israel's first king, he's out in the tool shed hiding behind the shovels. So they brought him in verse 23 from there. And when he stood among the people, again, it points out his height. He was taller than any of the people from his shoulders upwards. And Samuel in verse 24 says, do you see him whom the Lord has chosen? There's nobody like him among our people. He's clearly special and unique. He's your king. At the end of verse 24, the people in response to this unanimously say, long live the king. So here you've got Saul, this man who is, and I understand this curse that he's been afflicted with of just unparalleled good looks. And he's so strikingly handsome. He's so tall. Physically, he has been blessed by God with an appearance that just his appearance has a presence to it. I mean, it's the type of appearance and the type of presence that should inspire confidence among the people. Now, beyond that, he has had the Spirit of God confirm in his heart, you're the first king of Israel. He's had him further confirm that he is prophesying to a degree that other prophets think, man, have you gone to seminary and you're now a preacher too? And as if that weren't enough, it was Samuel. Again, it's not some bozo from the circus. Samuel, this great hero of the Old Testament, one of the greatest prophets, if not the greatest prophet that we find in the Old Testament, that God uses to go say, you're the one that's the desire of the nation of Israel. Saul has received confirmation after confirmation after confirmation. This is what God is up to, and this is how he's at work in your life. And does it instill and spawn courage? Does it lead Saul to square his shoulders back and say, well, God's in this, let's go? No. He's over in the Leonard building, hiding behind a batch of shovels. But then again, I suppose that shouldn't have come as a great surprise because Saul was a lone ranger. And this task that he was presented with, he thought it all revolved around him. And so, even though God confirmed, this is what I am up to, this is my choice, this is how I'm going to enable, Saul is a chicken. He doesn't respond with courage, he responds with fear and actually hides. God has worked through repeated ways to show Saul what he was up to, that he was at work. But in spite of that confirmation, Saul had an absolute lack of courage because, I believe, this simple fact, Saul didn't really trust God. Saul did not really trust God. You have probably noticed when I preach, I use notes. And as I use notes, I am not dependent necessarily on them. I don't want to stand up here and read to you because I hate being read to, but I have notes with me. In fact, I have a full manuscript every time I preach. I have pages of the entire sermon. You could sit down and read it if you want to. It'd be riveting. Anyway, That's how I share a message. But I have that with me, not to read, but in the event that I lose my train of thought, I get carried away in some point, that helps me stay on track. About 6 months ago, though, I began using a tablet. And I don't know if you've noticed, but this is what I've been looking at this morning. Okay, this is what I'm supposed to say next. Anyway. And one of the things I appreciated about that was the thought that nobody would ever see me shuffling any pages, because that's what I would do before. I can just do that and the page turns. Isn't that exciting? Anyway, I remember the first Sunday that I used this. It was about 6 months ago. And I was a little nervous about it because, I've got a very regimented routine in how I do things, and so this was a little bit new. And I was a little bit concerned with a piece of technology because technology can work really well or it can also fail. And so what I decided I was going to do was, on that first Sunday, I'm going to print out a hard copy of the manuscript, and I'm going to stick that here in the pulpit so that just in case something happens, I've got that to fall back on. And so that morning, when it came time to preach, I had the tablet there, my notes were in the pulpit, and everything worked fine, no problem whatsoever. The next week, I still had a printed copy, and the week after that, I still had a printed copy. But after about the third week, I didn't just choose not to print out a hard copy anymore. I just kind of forgot to. And I probably went 5 or 6 weeks after that just using the tablet, and I didn't have any printed notes with me. But then there was one Sunday, a couple of months into this, that I was getting ready to leave my office to come into the sanctuary for the beginning of the service. I grabbed my Bible, I grabbed my tablet, and then it struck me, I didn't print out a copy of the sermon. It's really kind of foolish not to. Let me go ahead and do that. I printed it off, I stuck it in the pulpit. Anyway, so when it came time for me to preach that morning, I stood up, and the tablet is going fine. The introduction I see is on there, and I'm walking back and forth. And as I pass by, I'm halfway through the introduction, I glance down, and I see the Google logo. And immediately I knew what was going on, that this device has rebooted itself. And I knew, given the fact that it has rebooted itself, my sermon's not still sitting there. And I would have to stop for maybe 10 or 15 seconds to get to the right place to get that document back open. And I thought, I cannot do that. I will not do that. And so as seamlessly as I could, I just reached in here and I just pulled these out and I slid the tablet over to the side, and hopefully you didn't even notice what was going on. I'm good at this. Anyway, that day I had a manuscript printed. This morning, what I have in my hand that I had stuck here in the pulpit. And every week since then, I've had a printed hard copy of the notes. Why is that? Because of this simple fact. When given the opportunity to do so, this device confirmed to me that it cannot be trusted implicitly. It cannot be trusted implicitly. What I'm getting ready to say is so simple, it would be so easy to dismiss. But if there's no other takeaway, underscore this thought in your mind. The entire successful living of the Christian life hinges on this singular thought. You can trust God. Everything hinges on that thought. If you want to come to God in salvation, it requires you trusting Him. If you want to walk in Him and grow with Him, it requires you trusting Him. If you want to be the kind of man, the woman, the husband, the father, the believer, the preacher, the deacon, the usher, whatever that God intends, it's going to require you doing something, trusting God, and you've got to get it settled in your heart. You've got to choose in your mind, I can trust Him. And not only can I trust Him, I can trust Him to the point and to the degree that I do not have to have a plan B. I don't need a backup plan just in case. In fact, when He is at work and begins to reveal His plan and the ways in which that involves you, and the way in which He wants to accomplish His work involving you, you can so trust Him that there ought not be any fear. There ought not be any trepidation. There ought not be any moment's reservation. No cowardice, because the success of that plan, get this, it does not depend on you because it wasn't your plan after all. It's His plan and His work that He wants to accomplish through you. The success doesn't depend on me. It doesn't depend on you. It depends on the author of the plan. That ought to instill courage. It ought to inspire confidence. It should have led Saul to say, man, this is a big deal. This is an enormous challenge. It's a great honor. But God's chosen me for this, and He seems to be in it. So let's go. Let's go. Because we're dependent on Him. But you don't find that in Saul, because Saul was a lone ranger. There, in my life, in your life, ought not be any fear, any absence of courage, spiritually speaking, unless you want to be a lone ranger. Unless, of course, you want to operate your life without God. Unless, of course, you want to operate without His power, His guidance, His resources, His ability, His insight, and His wisdom. All that leads me to ask you two simple questions this morning in closing. What we've talked about this morning, these are the litmus tests, the criteria that we can use to evaluate whether that Lone Ranger mentality has got into our minds and into our hearts. Here then is the question. Are you living like a Lone Ranger? Is what we've been talking about. Do you find these things to be true in you as they were true in Saul? And if that's the case, I'm not here to wag my finger at you, because each of us, to varying degrees, struggles with this. So if you say, yeah, that's me, here's the second question. Are you going to continue operating as the Lone Ranger? Or are things going to change starting today? I want you to bow your heads with me.